The grain dust on the stone floor clung to their sandals, and the ruler above them was Joseph. The same brother they had pushed out of the family story was now the one holding the storehouses open or shut with a word. Let that settle in, because some people really do believe they got away with it. They think if enough time passes, if enough miles stretch between the wound and the witness, then the truth goes soft, and heaven forgets how to count. But this story says otherwise. This one says the silence was not emptiness, but strategy. While they were living inside the version of events that protected them, God was building something they could not see. Picture the room. Cool stone, air dry with chaff. Men bent low, tired from hunger, robes creased from travel, hands empty. And the one they once stripped of dignity is standing over the grain of a nation. Standing still, not pacing or raging or exposing himself too soon. Just watching, measuring, seeing all of it. They bowed without knowing, and that right there is the kind of reversal your enemies never plan for. They prepare for your breakdown. They do not prepare for your elevation. You need to hear this the right way. Joseph is not standing there because life was fair to him. He is not there because people suddenly became kind. He is there after betrayal, after being thrown into a pit, after being sold, after years when the wrong people seemed to have all the leverage. That is why this moment burns. The men below him are not facing luck. They are facing preserved destiny. The pit could not bury your destiny when God wrote something deeper than family jealousy over your life. And the hardest part for the betrayers? He recognized them before they recognized him. That is the part that shakes the whole room. Power, awareness, survival, memory. He knows exactly who is kneeling there, and they still think they are standing inside an ordinary transaction. If this kind of truth speaks to you, subscribe and stay with me, because how Joseph got to that throne is where the real unveiling begins. And that is why you cannot read this moment in the grain hall like a simple family reunion. What you're looking at is the end of a pattern that started long before the famine, long before the prison, even long before Egypt. It started the minute the people closest to him realized this young man carried something they could not control. You know that feeling when your peace bothers people more than your mistakes ever did? When the favor on your life says nothing out loud, but somehow it still agitates the room. That was the air around him. He wasn't loud or scheming. The future kept leaning toward him, and they could feel it. There had been dreams, not random scraps of sleep, but the kind that stay in your chest after morning comes. The kind that make even a quiet house feel charged. Sheaves rising, stars bowing. Images so clear you could almost see the pale dawn light on his face as he told them. And that is where many people miss the danger. They think betrayal begins with action. It begins with irritation, with glances, with the stiff jaw at the table, with the way people go cold when your calling reminds them of their own unresolved emptiness. His brothers did not just dislike him. They resented what his life suggested, that God might choose the overlooked route, the younger one, the one they did not expect. And once jealousy matures, it starts looking for a legal way to hate you. It builds a case in secret. It waits for a field, a distance, a moment with no father watching. That unnamed hostility always does the same thing. It smiles while it calculates. It speaks plain while it hides intent. It lets you walk toward it under the cover of family. So when the day came and Joseph was sent out to check on them, he was not walking into a misunderstanding. He was walking into a decision already ripening in other men's hearts. Dust on his sandals, open land ahead, no warning in the wind, at least not the kind ordinary ears could catch. But heaven had seen the pit before his brothers ever found one. So when he finally reached them, the first thing waiting was recognition without love. You can almost hear it if you stay with the scene. Wind dragging over dry grass, the scrape of sandals turning all at once, a few low voices, too low to be innocent. He came carrying trust, and they met him carrying decision. That is the part people do not talk about enough. Betrayal is rarely sudden to the ones committing it. By the time you feel the shove, they have already rehearsed the story that will justify it. They closed around him fast. Hands where brothers' hands should not have been. The garment that marked him was pulled away, not because cloth had power, but because they wanted to strip the sign before they silenced the person. And then came the pit. Stone walls, stale air, the smell of dirt that had not seen light in a long time. No ladder, no easy grip, just the shock of landing where family decided your voice no longer mattered. If you've ever been dropped into confusion by the very people who should have covered you, you know this kind of darkness has a different temperature. It is not just pain, it is disbelief. But even there, the hidden thing remained. The pit could not bury your destiny. They could lower the body and still fail to reach the promise. And listen, they did not stop at isolation. That unnamed hostility wanted profit from the wound. When travelers passed by, they saw an opportunity, a transaction, something to move, something to remove. So he was lifted out, not into freedom, but into sail, dust in his mouth, rope rough against his skin, eyes forced toward a road he did not choose. It is a brutal kind of evil when people convert relationship into currency and then act as if heaven did not see the exchange. Back home, they prepared the lie, a stained garment, a father left to grieve a version of events built by deception. And while that false story settled over the house like smoke, Joseph was being carried toward a land he had never asked to see. Egypt was getting closer. By the time that road ended, the air had changed. Egypt did not smell like home. It smelled of river mud, pressed linen, oil, sweat, animals, and hot stone baking under a white sky. New voices moved around him, fast, sharp, and unfamiliar. New hands directed him. New walls closed in. And this is where a lot of people expect the story to go numb. As if being carried far enough can separate a man from what God spoke over him. But exile does not cancel assignment. Distance does not erase design. The same one who was lowered into the dark was now standing in a foreign land, and heaven had not misplaced him for 1 second. He was bought into the house of an Egyptian officer, used, counted, never welcomed as family, never honored as a visionary, positioned according to other people's authority. But watch this closely, because this is where the mystery deepens. The people around him could control his labor, not his core. They could decide his task, not his spirit. And some of you have lived that kind of season, where everything on the outside says limitation, yet something inside you refuses to bend crooked. That is preserved identity. So he worked, he listened, he learned the rhythms of rooms that were not built for him. The slap of sandals in the courtyard, the scrape of jars being moved before dawn, the careful order of a household that noticed when one man's hands were steady and clean. Favor began to gather around him quietly, undeniable. The same people who would never have chosen him started trusting him with more. That's how divine intelligence moves sometimes, with weight, not noise, with fruit, not performance. Stillness was strategy, even there. And let me say this plainly, the hostile ones always misread that season. They think if you are serving, you are small. If you are quiet, you are defeated. If you are faithful in a hidden room, you must not know your worth. But the hidden room is often where God trains your hands before he opens the gate. And just when this man began to stand firm in that house, a different kind of trap started forming around him. That trap did not come with a warning sign. It came in the middle of ordinary days. Folded garments, open doorways, sunlight on plaster, the quiet routines of a household that had begun to trust him. That is how corruption likes to move. Sometimes with invitation, sometimes with pressure wrapped in opportunity. And the man at the center of it had to make a choice that would cost him either way: yield and betray the God who had preserved him, refuse and anger the kind of power that does not like hearing no. He refused. And I need you to catch the weight of that. He was far from home, cut off from everyone who knew his story, carrying no public protection, no family shield, no crowd to defend his name. Yet he still chose clean hands. That is spiritual strength people overlook. They celebrate the throne later, but they do not always honor the closed door, the turned face, the decision made when compromise looked easier than consequence. In that room, no brother was watching, no father was watching, but heaven was. So he stepped back from what would stain him, and in doing that, he stepped right into the next storm. Because rejected temptation can become wounded pride. And wounded pride, when it has status, is dangerous. Suddenly, the air changed. The same house where his work had spoken well for him filled with accusation. Voices sharpened, trust snapped. The story turned against him so fast it must have felt unreal, like sand shifting under solid ground. This is the cruelty of false blame. It does not ask whether you are innocent, only whether the lie is useful. And to the people who already needed him small, that lie was very useful. The one who would not bend could now be branded. The one who stayed upright could now be treated as crooked. So the faithful servant became the accused man. And if you have ever done right only to watch the story get twisted against you, then you already know this ache. It is one thing to be wounded. It is another thing to be wounded and then handed the name of the wounder. But he did not explode. He did not unravel. Stillness was strategy, even when the chains came close enough to hear. Then the door of the prison opened, and Joseph disappeared behind it. Behind that door, the sound changed first. No courtyard rhythm now, no ordered household, just iron scraping stone, low voices echoing off damp walls, the stale smell of sweat, mildew, and old straw pressed into the floor. This was a different kind of burial, slower, colder, built to make a man disappear without anyone needing to explain where he went. And yet, the same thing happened here that happened in the pit. What was done to reduce him became the very place where God kept preserving him. That matters, because many people can survive one sharp betrayal and still get hollowed out by long injustice. The first wound shocks you. The long season tests whether your soul will stay clean. He had already been betrayed by blood, sold by hands that should have protected him, accused after doing right. And now prison wanted to teach him the final lie, the ugliest one, that delay means abandonment. but he did not let the cell rename him. That was the victory before any promotion ever came. So he kept showing up as himself. In a place where bitterness would have felt justified, he stayed useful. In a place where anger could have ruled the room, he kept his spirit steady. You could hear chains clink when men shifted in the dark, hear the cough of sleepless prisoners before dawn, see torchlight tremble against rough walls, and somehow, even there, trust started gathering around him again. Because divine favor has a way of finding a faithful man in hidden places. And that is what unsettles the hostile ones most, whether they ever admit it or not. They can plan the pit, they can profit from the sale, they can twist the accusation, but they cannot stop God from causing your character to speak in rooms designed to silence you. The same pattern kept repeating. Wherever he was placed, order followed. Wherever he was buried, clarity rose. The man they tried to reduce kept becoming more himself, not less. Then one day the prison air shifted again. Two new men arrived from the ruler's circle, carrying the smell of palace oil and panic into that dark place. Their faces were tight, sleep gone from their eyes. By morning, both of them had dreamed something that left them shaken, and the prisoner who noticed was the same man everyone else kept underestimating. He noticed because suffering had not made him self-absorbed. That is a detail you do not rush past if you understand this story. The prison had every reason to shrink a man inward, to make him stare only at his own loss, his own delay, his own unanswered questions. But he still looked up. He still read faces. He still cared enough to ask why two officials woke with dread sitting on their chests. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths dry, their sleep broken by images they could not shake. And the same prisoner everyone kept misjudging spoke into that fear with calm. Not swagger, just quiet certainty. He told them the meaning of dreams belongs to God. There it is again, the thing the hostile ones never know what to do with. He had been stripped, sold, blamed, locked away, and still he did not turn bitter or grab for false power. He did not make himself the source. He stayed aligned. That is why insight kept finding him. Divine intelligence was not showing up as a party trick. It was coming through a man who had suffered without letting suffering become his master. So each official spoke, one after the other, and he listened with the kind of attention that comes from a spirit trained in hidden places. Then he answered. One dream carried restoration, the other carried warning. He did not blur them to keep the room comfortable. He did not soften the truth so everyone could leave feeling fine. He said what was given to him plainly, even when one answer was hard to hear. That matters because real discernment is not flattery. It does not protect feelings at the cost of truth. And when he finished, the air in that prison cell must have felt different, tighter somehow, like the walls themselves had leaned in. Because both men knew he had seen straight through what their sleep had concealed. Then came one small request, the kind that sounds simple when you say it out loud. When the restored official returned to the ruler's court, he was to remember the innocent man left behind. And for a moment, maybe just a moment, it looked like the door was about to open. But some delays hurt worse, because hope got close enough to touch. The official walked back into light, back into polished halls, back into life beyond bars. And Joseph stayed where he was, waiting to find out whether being seen meant being remembered. He was not remembered right away. That is one of the sharpest cuts in the whole story. Sharper than the pit, the sale, even the accusation. This part right here, when the word should have come back and didn't. Days in the prison kept their rough rhythm. Light slid in, thin across the floor, then faded. Footsteps passed. Keys rang. Straw shifted under tired bodies. And the man who had spoken truth with clean motives was left sitting inside somebody else's convenience. You need to understand that kind of delay, because a lot of people lose themselves there. Not in the crisis, but in the silence after they did everything right. Still, he remained himself. Then the turn came from above, the way it so often does when heaven is ready to interrupt a closed system. The ruler of Egypt began waking with dread on him. Dreams had visited him in the night with images too heavy to ignore. Lean cattle swallowing fat ones, thin heads of grain consuming the full. Strange, unsettling pictures. He could feel there was meaning in them, but not reach it. So the court was stirred. Voices filled the halls. Advisors were called. Men trained to sound confident stood there with polished words and empty hands. And that is when the forgotten prisoner became impossible to ignore. The same official who had once walked away from the cell finally felt memory strike him like heat. You can almost hear the shift, the pause, the swallowed breath, the sudden shame of realizing the answer had been sitting in a dungeon while important men searched in circles. That's how God exposes false hierarchies. He lets the room exhaust its noise before calling for the one carrying the real word. The hostile ones never see that coming. They think if they bury you low enough, your voice can't reach the chamber that matters. But when the appointed hour arrives, your name can cross doors your feet never could. So the report was given. There is a Hebrew in prison. He interprets dreams. And just like that, the place of confinement stopped being the end of Joseph's story and became the doorway to a summons. They hurried to bring him out of stale air, out of waiting, out of concealment. But being called up is one thing. What he says in the ruler's presence is another. So they brought him up fast. You can feel the rush of it. Water poured for washing, prison dust scrubbed from skin, rough clothes replaced, oil and clean linen where mildew had been. 1 hour, you are hearing chains and echoing footsteps. The next, you are standing under a ceiling meant for rulers. That kind of turn can make a person dizzy. He did not walk in begging. He did not walk in performing. He carried the same steady spirit out of confinement that he had carried inside it. The ruler told the dreams again, and the room must have held its breath. Fat cattle swallowed by gaunt ones, full heads of grain consumed by thin, scorched heads. Disturbing images, not because they were strange only, but because they felt like warning wearing a mask. And here is where the man from the prison did something the proud never do. He refused to steal credit. He said the answer was not in him by his own power. God would give the ruler the meaning. That told you this was not ambition dressed up as holiness. He was not trying to impress the room. He was honoring the source in the middle of the opportunity. Then he spoke plainly. The dreams were one message told twice. Years of abundance were coming first. Fields full, granaries filling, bread warm and easy, harvest thick in the air. After that, famine, severe enough to swallow memory. Hard enough to make the good years seem like a story people had imagined. He did not stop at warning either. This is where divine intelligence separated itself from mere insight. He gave the interpretation, and then he gave the strategy. Appoint a wise man. Store grain during the plentiful years. Prepare while the world still feels safe. Do you hear the reversal in that? The one they tried to bury was no longer just explaining symbols. He was showing a kingdom how to survive. Stillness was strategy all along. Those hidden years had not emptied him. They had trained him to speak with weight when the hour finally opened. And now the room had a bigger problem than the dream. Because once he finished, the question was no longer, what does this mean? It was, who in this whole land can be trusted to carry what he just revealed? That question answered itself almost as soon as it was asked. The ruler looked across his court. Polished men, practiced men, men with titles, men with posture, and none of them carried what this former prisoner carried: weight, clean discernment, a mind able to hold both warning and wisdom at the same time. So the impossible happened in open daylight. The one who had been managed by others was suddenly entrusted over others. Rings changed hands. Fine linen replaced prison cloth. Orders began moving through the palace because a man pulled from confinement had spoken with more clarity than the whole room combined. Sit with that for a second. Some people think vindication always comes with applause from the ones who wronged you. No. Sometimes vindication looks like assignment. It looks like responsibility landing on shoulders that were once pinned down. It looks like the people who could not see your value being bypassed, while God places you where your gift can feed nations. Joseph was not lifted so he could gloat. He was lifted because famine was coming, and heaven does not raise a prepared vessel for decoration. So he got to work. Storehouses had to be organized. Grain had to be gathered while the fields still gave freely. Records had to be kept. Routes had to be watched. Men had to be appointed. Cut grain, dry husks, full sacks, clay jars, dust in sunlight, all of it became part of his new life. He moved through abundance with urgency because he had already seen what others could not see yet. That is another kind of spiritual maturity. When blessing comes, you do not waste it just because it feels good in the moment. You build, you prepare, you honor the warning inside the plenty. And this is where the hidden reversal gets even sharper. The hostile ones back home had once treated him like a problem to remove. Meanwhile, he was becoming the steward of survival in the very years that would decide who ate and who did not. They had no idea what was forming beyond their line of sight. They did not know the brother they sold was learning how to govern scarcity before scarcity ever touched them. Then the years shifted. The good harvests slowed. The wind changed. Fields no longer answered the same way. Hunger began moving across lands, quiet at first, and then impossible to ignore. Far away, in the house that had lived under a lie, empty cupboards were starting to speak. That famine did not arrive with drama at first. It came in the small ways people try to ignore. Less grain in the jar, thinner bread, fields giving back more dust than promise, the smell of dry earth hanging longer in the air, animals growing restless. Men speaking lower at the doorway because worry had entered the house and sat down like it belonged there. And in the home that once hid a lie under a stained garment, hunger started doing what truth often does, pressing old things toward the surface. Back in Egypt, the man over the storehouses was ready. That is the part you cannot miss. He had not wasted the years of plenty. He had listened when others might have relaxed. He had built when others might have celebrated too early. So when nations began reaching for help, there was grain, there was order, there was a system strong enough to hold under pressure. The one, once treated like a burden, had become the keeper of provision for multitudes. And then the road from home turned toward him. His brothers were sent down to buy grain. Think about that. The very men who once priced his life in a moment of jealousy were now traveling because they had no answer of their own. Sand on their hems, hunger in their bodies, need in their faces. They were moving toward the one they had tried to erase, and they did not know it. That is how divine reversal works sometimes. It does not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it waits until the proud have to ask for what only the wounded were prepared to give. When they entered his presence, the old dream stood up in real time. They bowed without knowing. The room, the grain, the silence, the memory. It all came crashing together in that instant. He recognized them at once. Age had changed details, sure, but not enough to hide them from the eyes of the one who had carried the wound all these years. And suddenly, the governor of Egypt was also the young man from the field, the pit, the road, the prison. All of it was in the room with him at once. But they did not recognize him, and that changed everything. Because now the question was no longer whether God had fulfilled the dream. The question was what a man does when the people who broke him are kneeling in front of him, empty-handed. What he did next is where weak storytelling would expect an outburst. But that is not this man. He did not jump from the seat. He did not cry out their names across the room. He did not rush to expose the wound just because the wound had finally walked back in. He stayed composed, his face held. His questions were measured. The smell of grain still hung in the air, sandals still scraped on stone, servants still moved in and out with baskets and tall jars, and in the middle of all that ordinary motion, a storm was happening inside him that nobody else could see. This is the part people misunderstand. Restraint is not confusion. Delay is not weakness. Stillness was strategy. So he began to speak to them as a governor would, not yet as a brother. He listened to their answers. He watched how quickly they explained themselves. He heard the names they used for home, for their father, for the younger brother who had not come. Every word mattered, because this moment was bigger than recognition. He needed to know whether time had changed them, or whether the same spirit that sold him still sat behind their eyes. And let me tell you something. When God brings your past back into your presence, discernment matters more than emotion. Anybody can react. Anybody can release years of pain in one hot second. But wisdom waits. Wisdom listens. Wisdom tests the atmosphere before it reveals the heart. The one standing over Egypt had not survived all those years just to hand his authority over to impulse. He had learned too much in hidden places. So the pressure began. Questions sharpened. Their story was checked. Suspicion was allowed to sit on them for a while. Not because he needed drama, but because truth often rises when comfort leaves the room. The men who once controlled the narrative now had to answer for themselves, under a gaze they did not understand. And the strange thing is, their fear started talking before their mouths did. Old guilt was already near the surface. You could feel it in the way they moved, the way they watched one another, the way panic brushed against memory. He sent them away with grain, with a condition. If they came back, they were to bring the younger brother. And when those words landed, something old and buried started trembling in all of them. That younger brother was the hinge, because for the man in power, this was never only about grain. It was about truth. It was about whether the same men who once sacrificed one brother for their own comfort would do it again if pressure tightened around the family. So the test kept moving, precise. He had them brought back under conditions they could not control. He watched what happened when fear sat down among them. He listened as old guilt, buried for years, began speaking in half sentences and uneasy glances. And that is one of the deepest parts of this whole account. Conscience does not always stay quiet just because time passes. When trouble pressed on them in Egypt, their minds went backward, to him, to the day they ignored his cries, to the choice they had wrapped in secrecy and then buried beneath years of routine. You can almost feel the weight of that realization settling over them like thick dust. Their voices were lower now. Their confidence was gone. They were no longer just hungry men trying to buy grain. They were brothers standing near the echo of what they had done. He heard them. They did not know the governor understood their language, and that mattered, because now he was not hearing polished answers meant for power. He was hearing what men say when they think the authority in the room cannot fully catch it. That is where truth slips out. That is where the hidden thing starts breathing. The same brother they had misread long ago was still reading the room with more accuracy than they understood. Divine intelligence again. Quiet, exact, unsettling. But he did not reveal himself yet. Instead, the pressure deepened. The household needed to bring the younger one down. The father resisted. Hunger forced the issue. And when they finally returned with that brother beside them, the old wound and the present test stood face to face. He saw him, the son of the same mother, the living reminder of home before it split open. That sight had to hit him deep. Yet he held himself together. Stillness was strategy, not because he felt nothing, but because too much was at stake to move too soon. Then the final proving ground began to form. A setup, a hidden cup, a journey interrupted. One more moment designed to answer the question that had waited all these years. Had they changed, or had they only become more careful? When that moment came, the room tightened like a drawn cord. The cup was found with the younger brother. Sacks were opened. Grains spilled in pale streams across the floor. Cloth shifted. Hands trembled. And just like that, the old pattern had a chance to repeat itself. One favored son in danger. A father waiting far away. A group of brothers standing at the edge of another choice. This was no accident in the mind of the governor. He was uncovering the truth hidden underneath years of regret, years of hunger, years of careful words. Would they protect him or abandon him? That is the question betrayal must answer when it comes back around, with cost. Anybody can sound sorry when nothing is on the line. Anybody can say the right thing when the safe road is still open. But when sacrifice becomes necessary, character speaks much louder than memory. So he held the pressure in place and watched. The court was still. The air felt thick. Even the servants must have sensed that something larger than a missing cup was being weighed in that chamber. And then one of the brothers stepped forward. He pleaded to save the younger one, not himself or his comfort. He spoke of their father's grief, of the bond tied to this son, of the devastation that would follow if they returned without him. He offered himself instead. That is the turn. That is the place where the old spirit began to crack. Because years earlier, these men had let one brother vanish to protect themselves. Now one was willing to be lost so another could go free. Do you hear what happened there? The test had reached the heart. The men before him were no longer hiding behind the same coldness that once ruled them. Pain had done something. Time had done something. God had done something. Not perfection, but change. Real enough to cost them. Real enough to shake the one listening from behind the mask of power. And for the first time, the man over Egypt was no longer just evaluating them. He was fighting to hold himself together. His throat tightened. His chest must have burned. The sound of their words, the mention of their father, the sight of the younger one standing there, it all pressed against the walls he had built to survive. He had heard enough. And now the only question left was whether he could speak before the tears did. What broke first was his voice. He turned, dismissed the attendants, and cleared the room until only the brothers remained with him. You can imagine the sound of sandals backing away, the heavy door closing, the sudden quiet after all that ceremony. No court now, no performance, no safe distance. Just breath, memory, and the unbearable nearness of men who had once watched his life disappear down a road. Then the tears came. Not neat, not controlled, not the kind a powerful man schedules for later. They came from years stacked on years. The field, the pit, the chains, the prison, the waiting, the dreams, the grain hauls, the younger brother standing there, alive. And then he said it. I am Joseph. That sentence must have hit the room like the floor giving way. The men in front of him had bowed, spoken, pleaded, trembled, and all the while they had not known they were standing inside the fulfilled dream of the brother they sold. Now the mask was gone. The governor of Egypt and the lost son of their father were one and the same. You talk about a reckoning. This was it. Not because he lifted a hand against them, but because truth had finally stepped fully into the room. Their faces must have drained, their mouths must have gone dry, because in one breath, every buried thing came back alive. And here is what matters. He did not pretend it had not happened. He did not call evil kindness. He did not smooth over the wound so everyone could feel comfortable. The betrayal stayed real. The years stayed real. The grief stayed real. This was not cheap peace. This was not denial dressed up as spirituality. He named himself in front of the very men who had tried to erase him. And that alone was enough to expose everything they had done. The hostile ones are always shaken most when the one they harmed returns with both memory and power intact. So they stood there, terrified. Not because they were unsure who he was anymore, but because now they knew exactly who he was and exactly what he could do. And Joseph, through tears, opened his mouth again. What came next would decide whether this room became a courtroom or a place of mercy no one there had earned. What came out was a reversal. He told them not to be crushed by terror in his presence, because though they had sold him, God had sent him ahead to preserve life. Do you hear the difference? He did not erase the evil, he named it. He did not flatter them with a false version of the past. He told the truth about what they had done. But then he placed that truth inside a bigger truth. Heaven had not surrendered the story to their betrayal. That is the line so many people want to quote too quickly without respecting its weight. Meant for evil, turn to good. Those words are not cheap. They are not a sticker over trauma. They are not denial. They are spoken by a man who knew the smell of pits, the loneliness of foreign rooms, the sting of false blame, the slow ache of forgotten years. When he says God turned it, he is not speaking in theory. He is speaking from the other side of survival, from the throne that once looked impossible, from storehouses full of grain that existed because pain did not get the final say. And that is why his brothers could not process what they were hearing. They expected wrath. They expected score settling. They expected that memory plus power would equal destruction. That is how the world thinks. That is how wounded pride behaves. But the man in front of them had been shaped by something higher. His rise had not made him cruel. His accuracy had not made him cold. The same God who preserved him through injustice had also enlarged his vision enough to see purpose where others had only meant harm. Still, this was not soft sentiment. Forgiveness here carried backbone. He understood exactly what had happened. He simply refused to let the darkest act in the story become the final definition of the story. That is mastery. That is freedom. That is what hostile people never plan for. Not just that you survive, but that you become so clear in God that their worst act gets folded into your assignment instead of your identity. Then he moved closer. The space between ruler and brothers began to close. The tears were still fresh. Their fear was still real. His words had already cracked the whole room open. And now, he was about to do the one thing they were least prepared for. Not punish them, not dismiss them, but welcome them near. That welcome was real. He touched them. He wept over them. He spoke to them close enough for fear to feel the warmth of mercy. Think about that scene for a second. The same room that could have become the place of their undoing turned into the place where estranged brothers stood breathing again. Their shoulders, once tight with dread, had to start loosening one by one. The air changed, not because the past vanished, but because grace entered the space where punishment had every legal reason to sit. And then he started thinking beyond the room. That is another sign of a soul healed by God. He was past the thrill of being right. He was already moving toward preservation. Their father had to be brought down. The household had to be relocated. The famine was still real, and love had work to do. So the ruler, who had every excuse to keep his distance, began making provision for the very family line that had once fractured around him. Carts, grain, safe passage, a place to live. He was forgiving them with words and preparing a future for them with resources. Do you see how complete that reversal is? The one they had cast out became the one making room. The brother they priced like cargo became the one arranging shelter. This is why I keep saying vindication in God is deeper than exposure. Exposure only proves what they did. Redemption proves what heaven did with what they did. And the hostile ones, whether in Joseph's day or in yours, never know what to do with that. They can understand retaliation. They can understand bitterness. They can even understand distance. But a person who stays clear enough to bless after being broken, that unsettles a darker wisdom. He sent them back with instruction, not accusation. Do not quarrel on the way, he told them. Imagine that. No speech designed to shame them, no long reopening of the wound, just urgency, care, and a command meant to keep the old spirit from rising again on the journey home. Because even now, he was guarding the fragile beginning of restoration. And somewhere beyond that palace, an old father still believed one son was gone forever. The next voice to enter that grieving house would carry impossible news. Joseph was alive. The news reached home like rain hitting long cracked ground. At first, the father could not take it in. The words were too large. Alive? In Egypt? Ruling? After years of mourning, that kind of hope can feel almost cruel when it first arrives. But then he saw the wagons. He saw the grain. He saw the proof piled up in wood, cloth, and provision. And the old man's spirit rose again. The family that had once been split by secrecy began moving, together, toward the very land where God had kept the son they thought was gone. That is the final reversal. Not just that the betrayed one survived, but that the place of his affliction became shelter for the whole house. And when they came down, he did not meet them as a wound waiting to reopen. He met them as a son restored to his father, as a brother no longer hidden, as a man whose suffering had been turned into bread. The hands that once grabbed at him in envy were now reaching through famine for life, and the hands that could have closed in judgment stayed open. A field once lost a brother. Years later, a storehouse fed a family. Heaven writes over human sabotage, not by pretending the pit was shallow, but by setting a table so full that even the old hunger has to sit down and go quiet. By evening, the dust of travel had settled on the wagon wheels, and lamps were burning low in a safer place. Outside, grain rested in sacks against the wall, waiting for morning. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and keep close. There's more here for people learning how truth, patience, and mercy outlast the schemes built against them.